The sun over the New Mexico territory was not a gentle star, but an anvil, hammering the light into a sheet of shimmering copper that buckled and warped the horizon. Below it, the land was a testament to endurance, a cracked and thirsty canvas of ochre dust and skeletal sagebrush. Through this unforgiving landscape, a lone figure moved, his presence a quiet disturbance in the vast, heat-drowned silence. Beckett Cole, known to the few who knew him at all as Beck, sat his dun mare with the easy slump of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. His focus was narrowed to the earth, tracing the faint, split-toed impressions of a stray calf that had wandered from his meager herd. He rode along the dry artery of Sagebrush Ferry, a place that was neither a ferry nor home to much sagebrush anymore. It was a scar, a memory of water, now just a channel of deeper dust and stubborn, thorny weeds. The only sounds were the ones he made himself. The rhythmic sigh and squeak of his saddle leather was a familiar conversation, a cadence that measured the long, empty hours. The soft plod of his mare's hooves was the percussion, and the ever-present wind, a hot breath whistling through rock and bone-dry grass, was the melody. It was the music of solitude, a tune he had long ago stopped trying to escape. Loneliness, for Beck, was not an absence of company, but a constant, heavy presence, like the colt peacemaker that rode on his hip. Then, a new sound threaded its way through the wind's low moan. It was a dissonant note, unnatural and sharp, a sound so fragile it was almost not a sound at all, a hitching, tearing noise, like a thread being pulled to its breaking point, a breath. Human! Beck reined in his mare, the sudden halt in the saddle's song making the silence that followed feel immense. He stilled, head cocked, listening past the rush of blood in his own ears. It came again, a desperate little gasp for air that was immediately stolen by the arid wind. It was close. He dismounted, his movements economical, quiet. The jingle of his spurs was a soft, metallic whisper against the dirt, leaving his mare to stand ground-hitched, her reins trailing in the dust. He drew the Colt from its holster, not with aggression, but with the ingrained caution of a man who knew that the desert's deadliest creatures often walked on 2 legs. He moved toward a scraggly cluster of junipers, their gnarled branches offering the only real shade for miles. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if holding its breath. Parting the last of the thorny branches, Beck stepped into a small, sun-drenched clearing. Dominating the space was a massive, ancient cottonwood, its bark scarred and gray, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind. It should have been a place of sanctuary, a monument of shade and persistence. Instead, it had been made into a place of judgment. His eyes took a moment to adjust, to make sense of the shape that hung beneath the thickest limb. It was a woman. Her arms were stretched taut above her head, her wrists bound together by a length of coarse hemp rope slung over the branch. She was suspended so that the toes of her worn boots barely scraped the packed earth, forcing her to bear an agonizing fraction of her own weight on legs that had clearly given out long ago. Her body sagged, a puppet with its strings pulled tight. Nailed crudely to the trunk of the great tree was a plank of splintered wood. Scrawled across it in what looked like charcoal were 4 stark words, "No mercy for water thieves." The letters were jagged, angry, a verdict delivered without a courtroom, a sentence carried out under the pitiless eye of the sun. Beck's gaze shifted back to the woman. Her head was slumped forward, her face obscured by a cascade of dark ash-colored hair, matted with sweat and red dust. Her dress, a thing of faded calico patched in a dozen places, was torn at the shoulder and stained with a dark, rusty smear of dried blood that blended with the grime. He could see the raw, angry red rings around her wrists, where the rope had bit deep into her flesh, chafing the skin away. Her lips were cracked and swollen, a faint, dark line of dried blood tracing a path from one corner of her mouth. She was a picture of brutal, silent suffering. A cold knot tightened in Beck's gut. He had seen this before. He had seen the swift, unmerciful justice of the frontier, where a rumor was as good as evidence and a rope was the only judge. The sign was a brand, a declaration that this person was outside the protection of law or decency. To interfere was to take a side, to invite the same merciless judgment upon himself. Water was life in this territory, more precious than gold. An accusation of stealing it was the gravest of sins. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, flashed behind his eyes another time, another cry for help he had been too slow to answer. A face, small and scared, looking to him for a strength he hadn't possessed. The guilt was an old phantom, one that still haunted the quiet corners of his soul. He hesitated, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Colt, his mind a battlefield of caution and conscience. The desert taught a man to mind his own business, that survival was a solitary affair. But then, the woman stirred. A low moan, barely a whisper of sound, escaped her cracked lips. It was the sound of a spirit not yet broken, a flicker of life refusing to be extinguished. It cut through his paralysis, a blade severing the ropes of his own fear and doubt. The memory of his past failure burned in him, and in that instant, he made a choice. He would not be too late again. Holstering his pistol, he moved forward, his boots scuffing softly in the dust. He pulled a worn but sharp skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The woman didn't seem to register his approach. Reaching up, he sawed at the thick rope. The fibers were tough, resisting at first, then giving way with a series of sharp, protesting snaps. With a final, decisive cut, the rope parted. Her body, deprived of its cruel support, fell forward in a boneless heap. Beck dropped the knife and lunged, catching her before she could hit the ground. She was lighter than he'd expected, a fragile collection of bones, but she burned with a feverish heat that soaked through his chambray shirt. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the frantic, ragged flutter of her breath, each gasp a desperate battle for life. For a long moment, he just held her, this stranger, this accused thief, feeling the fragile, thrumming pulse of her life against him. The profound, shocking intimacy of the contact broke through the calloused walls of his solitude. Gently, he eased her down to a sitting position, her back against the rough bark of the cottonwood. She didn't open her eyes, but her breathing was already a little less frantic, a little deeper. He shrugged off his own dusty canvas jacket, the garment worn thin at the elbows but still sturdy. He draped it over her shoulders, a small shield against the world that had tried to break her. He knelt beside her, his voice low and rough from disuse, the words more a vow to himself than a promise to her. "No one's gonna hurt you again," he murmured. She gave no sign that she'd heard. With a care he didn't know he possessed, he scooped her into his arms. The effort was nothing. The responsibility felt immense. He carried her out of the clearing, away from the scene of her torment, and back toward his waiting mare. He settled her in the saddle first, her body slumping against the horn, before mounting behind her, his arms coming around to hold her secure against his chest. As he turned the mare and urged her into a slow, careful walk toward the distant promise of his homestead in Juniper Draw, the wind picked up in the clearing behind them. It swirled the dust and nudged at the crude wooden sign still nailed to the tree. The old nails, loosened by the strain, finally gave way. The plank of wood clattered to the ground, landing face down in the red dirt. The angry words, the merciless verdict, were silenced, swallowed by the very earth they sought to sanctify. The curse against the weak lay dormant, for now, a secret kept by the dust and the whispering leaves of the ancient cottonwood. Beckett Cole's cabin was not a home. It was an anchor, a single square room of rough-hewn pine logs, chinked with mud and straw, standing defiant against the vast, empty canvas of the desert. It sat on the very edge of Juniper Draw, a place that held on to its name by the sheer stubbornness of the few dozen gnarled trees that hadn't yet surrendered to the drought. Inside, the world was reduced to essentials: a cast-iron stove, cold since morning, a narrow cot built into the wall, a rough plank table with one three-legged stool, and shelves holding tins, a sack of flour, and a near-empty keg of water. The air was still and hot, smelling of old smoke, axle grease, and the faint, metallic tang of the dust that sifted in through every crack. He had carried her inside, her weight almost nothing, and laid her on his own cot. She had collapsed into the thin mattress and not moved, her breathing the only sign she was still among the living. Now, hours later, the single window was a square of blinding white gold as the afternoon sun began its slow, merciless descent. Beck moved with a deliberation that bordered on ritual. He stoked the stove, the scrape of the iron poker unnaturally loud. He added a few precious sticks of juniper, and soon a plume of gray smoke feathered from the tin chimney. He filled his kettle from the water barrel, noting with a grim tightening of his jaw how low the level was, and set it on the stove to heat. She watched him. He could feel her gaze on his back. It was not a look of curiosity or gratitude, but the fixed, wary stare of a cornered animal. Her eyes, visible through the tangled curtain of her dark, ash-colored hair, were wide and alert, tracking his every movement. He turned from the stove, and she flinched, a tiny, involuntary recoil that tightened his throat. He said nothing. Words were useless here. He retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. Inside lay a bar of lye soap, a spool of thread, a needle, and a few strips of clean, white cloth torn. He realized, from the only good shirt he owned, he set them on the table. When the kettle whistled, its shrill cry cutting the silence, he poured some of the steaming water into a tin basin, cooling it with a dipper from the barrel until it was just warm. He brought the basin, the soap, and the cloths to the cot. He didn't ask permission. He simply knelt on the packed earth floor. "Your hands," he said. His voice was a low rasp, unused to softness. She hesitated, her entire body tensing, but she didn't, or couldn't, pull away. Slowly, as if lifting a terrible weight, she offered her wrists. They were a ruin. The coarse rope had done its work, rubbing the skin raw, leaving deep, weeping grooves that were already inflamed and caked with dried blood and dirt. The flesh was swollen, angry, purple, and red. Beck's face remained a mask of neutrality, but his hands, as he took hers, were impossibly gentle. His large, calloused fingers, stained from leather and earth, moved with a surgeon's care. He dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to clean the wounds. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and tried to snatch her hands back, but he held her firm. Not tight, just firm. "Hold still," he commanded, his voice flat but not unkind. "This'll fester if we let it." He worked methodically, washing away the grime, his touch as light as he could make it. She watched him, her jaw set, her body rigid with the effort of not screaming. He could see the pulse hammering in her throat, a small, frightened bird trapped beneath her skin. He said nothing, just cleaned, dried, and then wrapped her wrists in the clean, white strips of cloth. His knots were neat, practical. He had done the same for injured stock a dozen times, but this was different. The fragile bones beneath his fingers, the feverish heat of her skin, it all felt intensely, dangerously human. When her hands were bandaged, he looked down at her feet. Her boots were cracked, the soles worn through. He had removed them when he brought her in. Her feet, bare on the cot's rough blanket, were bruised and cut, layered with the same red-brown grime. He stood, emptied the now pink water out the cabin door, and refilled the basin. He knelt again. He didn't ask this time either. He simply took her left foot in his hand. It was ice cold, despite the heat of the day. He submerged it in the warm water. Mara Ellison made her first sound, a choked sob, a sound of such profound and sudden breakage that Beck froze. Her eyes squeezed shut, and a single tear cut a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He didn't know if it was from pain or from this simple, unexpected act of care. He said nothing, just held her foot steady in the water. He washed it, and then the other. He washed away the evidence of her ordeal, the dust of Sagebrush Ferry, the blood from sharp rocks, the grime of her capture. The water in the basin turned a dark, muddy red. The air in the small cabin grew thick, heavy with all the questions he wouldn't ask and all the answers she couldn't give. She still hadn't spoken a single word. He didn't know her name. Not yet. He thought of her only as Ellis, the name on the warrant he hadn't yet seen. A name he'd plucked from the ether to keep a necessary distance. But as he dried her feet on a piece of sacking, that distance felt thin, as fragile as a pane of glass in a hailstorm. His eyes kept finding their way back to her, to the defiant set of her jaw even in her broken state, to the dark, matted hair, to the pale, clear line the single tear had drawn. That night, as twilight bled purple and indigo across the desert, he set a tin plate of warmed-over beans and a cup of water by the cot. She didn't touch it. He took his bedroll and his heavy Spencer rifle from the wall hooks. "You're safe," he said to the room. "Bolts on the inside." He let himself out, the door clicking shut behind him. He slept in the barn, a three-sided lean-to that offered little comfort but a clear view of the cabin. The smell of dry hay, horse, and the one milk cow was a familiar solace. He laid the Spencer beside him on the straw, its brass-bound stock cool against his hand. He did not sleep well. He listened to the coyotes, to the shifting weight of his mare in her stall, and to the profound, aching silence from the cabin. He did this for 2 nights. On the second day, she had eaten the food he left. She had moved from the cot to the stool by the window, her bandaged wrists resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the unchanging horizon. She looked like a ghost, haunting a life she was no longer part of. They had exchanged no words. The third morning dawned clear and sharp. A chill in the air promised that autumn was not far off. Beck rose before the sun, his routine unbroken. He milked the cow, forked hay to the mare, and then, as he always did, took a slow walk around the perimeter of his small property. It was then he saw them. They were not the familiar, scuffed tracks of his own worn-out boots. These were precise, deliberate. The prints of a cavalry boot, the heels marked by the distinct, straight-edged line of hobnails. Someone had ridden close in the pre-dawn dark, surveyed the cabin and the barn, and then ridden away, heading east toward the pass. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in his stomach. He moved quickly back to the cabin. The door was unbolted. He pushed it open. Mara was already standing by the window, where she'd spent all of the previous day. But her posture was different. Her shoulders were no longer slumped in exhaustion, but were drawn in, tight and defensive. She had seen the rider, too. Beck stopped just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. "We got uninvited company," he said, his voice quiet. She turned from the window. Her eyes met his. And for the first time, they were not just vacant or terrified. They were knowing. She nodded. Once. He didn't have to wait long. An hour later, as the sun began to beat down in earnest, a rider emerged from the shimmering heat. Not a drifter, not a cowboy. This man rode tall, his uniform a stark, dark blue against the pale landscape. He wore the authority of the U.S. Army like a second skin. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated barn, the thirsty-looking cow. And finally, Beck, who stood on the small, warped porch. "Beckett Cole," the man called out. His voice was crisp, educated. "Depends on who's asking," Beck replied, his hand resting on the porch post, inches from the holster he hadn't yet strapped on. The soldier dismounted, his movements economical. He was a lieutenant, his insignia catching the morning light. He was young, but his eyes were old, washed out and weary from staring at this unforgiving land. He walked to the porch, stopping at the bottom step. "Lieutenant Avery Pike, Fort Dust Holler." He reached into his tunic and produced a folded piece of paper. "I'm looking for a woman." Beck said nothing. He just waited. Pike unfolded the paper. It was a warrant, issued by the territorial marshal. Mara Ellison, widow, charged with accessory to destruction of property, water theft, and suspicion of murder. Pike looked up from the paper, his pale eyes boring into Beck. "The charge is for aiding the party that blew the Rio Seco Syndicate's diversion dam on Coyote Spring. A night watchman was killed. She was seen fleeing the area." Beck's expression didn't change. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he'd learned from the desert itself. Finally, he spoke, his voice deliberately flat, even bored. "Been dry," he said. "Ain't seen much of anyone. Seen nothing but jackrabbits and one stubborn steer that thinks my water trough is his personal saloon." Pike's jaw tightened. He held out the warrant. Beck took it, glanced at the words, "Mara Ellison. Widow suspicion of murder," and then folded it neatly back along its original creases. He handed it back to the lieutenant. "Can't help you." Pike took the paper, his eyes narrowing. He looked past Beck, toward the dark rectangle of the open cabin door. He could see nothing inside. "The syndicate wants that spring back. Coal. They're rebuilding the dam. They have a federal contract to supply the railroad." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't some squatter's dispute. This is progress. Don't get in the way of flowing water." The threat hung in the hot, still air. It was a warning, a promise, and an absolution for whatever came next. Pike stared at Beck for another long second, as if trying to memorize his face, then turned without another word. He swung into his saddle, wheeled his horse in a spray of gravel, and rode back the way he had come. Beck stood and watched until the rider was just a dark speck dissolving into the heat. The dust he had kicked up hung in the air, a golden, choking cloud, before slowly, particle by particle, settling back onto the thirsty earth. He turned and went back inside the cabin. The bolt. He had forgotten the bolt. Mara was still standing, no longer by the window, but in the center of the small room. She was standing where the dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the door. She was still wrapped in his jacket, which hung on her small frame like a canvas tent. Her bandaged wrists were held in front of her. She was looking at him. It was the first time she had truly looked at him. Not through him, not past him. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. It was stripped bare of terror, and all that was left was a raw, devastating exhaustion and a question. Beck looked at her, at this ghost of a woman who had brought the whole weight of the world, the syndicate, the army, a murder charge to his doorstep. He saw the warrant in his mind's eye, saw the rope burns on her wrists, saw the dead-end poverty of his own existence. He had stepped off his path to cut a rope, and in doing so, had tied his fate to hers. He let out a long breath he felt he'd been holding since he first heard her gasp in the clearing. He walked to the cabin door, the solid wooden plank he'd built himself. He swung it shut, plunging the room into shadow. He reached for the heavy wooden bar that served as a lock and slid it firmly into its iron brackets. The sound was final, a heavy, definitive thud. He turned to face her in the gloom. "They asked," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the small space. "I chose." The heavy bar on the door did not create a sanctuary. It merely defined the cage. For the rest of that day, a fragile truce held within the cabin's four walls. The silence between them was no longer empty, but charged, a living thing that breathed in the spaces their bodies did not occupy. When evening came, Beck set out food again, jerky and the last of his cornbread. This time, she ate with him, sitting on the stool while he leaned against the doorframe, both of them staring out at the deepening twilight as if it were a fire. The next afternoon, the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive silence drove them outside. They moved to the lee side of the cabin, a patch of hard-packed earth swept clean by the constant, scouring wind. Here, nothing grew. It was a blank slate. Mara moved to the center of this barren space and knelt. The motion was fluid, strangely graceful, like a priestess approaching an altar. With the long, slender finger of her right hand, she began to draw in the dust. Beck stood back, watching, his arms crossed over his chest. He expected a child's doodle, a meaningless line, but a shape began to form under her deliberate strokes. It was a bird, its head thrown back, its beak open. Then she added the details, a lattice of sharp, intersecting lines that pinned its wings, a single, long thorn piercing its breast, a starling, caught in a thorn bush. She looked at the drawing for a long time. When she finally spoke, Her voice was a ghost, a dry, rasping whisper, as if her vocal cords were unaccustomed to the work. "In my mother's village," she began, her gaze still fixed on the bird in the dust. "They tell the story of the thorn singer. It is a bird that only finds its true voice when it is pierced. The pain, they say it is the only thing that can create a song of such beauty." She traced one of the thorns pinning the wing. "The Yavapai believe it is a symbol that we are all this bird, that we must sing, even when the world holds us with thorns." She had named her people. It was the first piece of herself she had offered, a small, precious coin placed in the vast space between them. Beck remained silent, letting her words settle. He had known, of course. Her features, the high line of her cheekbones, the almond shape of her eyes, spoke of the blood of this land, in this territory. That was often enough to be a crime in itself. "The spring," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, a little texture. "They call it Coyote Spring. It has belonged to my mother's people for 100 generations. When I married my husband, Jacob, it was my dowry, my land, our land." She looked up at him then, her eyes dark and deep. "A man came, Silas Drummond. He works for the Rio Seco Railroad and Water Syndicate. He is a man who smiles while he measures you for a coffin. He said the railroad needed a reliable water source. He built a reservoir, a great earthen dam, and it starved my spring. The water that flowed to our small plot of land slowed to a trickle, then stopped." She paused, swallowing hard. "Jacob, he was a good man, a gentle man. He tried to reason with Drummond. He showed him the deeds, the territorial charters. Drummond just laughed. He said the paper was worthless, that the only law out here was the flow of capital. Then the fever came. It took Jacob in less than a week, left him a hollow shell, left me, alone." Her hand trembled as she brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "After Jacob was buried, Drummond came back. He offered me pennies for my land. He said a widow couldn't possibly manage it. He said he was doing me a kindness. When I refused, his smile disappeared. He said he would have my land, one way or another." Her gaze dropped back to the dusty ground. 2 weeks ago, someone blew a hole in his dam, not a big one, just enough to let some water through to relieve the pressure. One of his foremen, a cruel man named Finch, was found near the breach, drowned in 2 feet of water. They said his head had been struck. They said I was seen nearby. They said a grieving, half-breed widow, desperate for water, had killed him in a rage. She looked at Beck, her expression stripped of all artifice. "I did not do it. I was in my home, praying for rain, but who would believe me, so I ran. And they sent their men, and they found me." The story hung in the air, plain and brutal. It was a story as old as the territory itself, the story of the strong taking from the weak, dressing their greed in the clothes of law and progress. Beck felt an old, familiar ache in his chest. It was the ache of helplessness, the ghost of a failure he had carried for 15 years. He looked away from her, his eyes tracing the sharp, unforgiving line of the distant mesas. "When I was 17, he said, his own voice sounding distant, "my family had a small spread up near the Cimarron. Just my PA and my sister, Ellie. She was 14. He picked up a small, flat stone, turning it over and over in his palm. The stone was warm from the sun. Rustlers came one night, not for the cattle, for the horses. Pa had a fine Morgan stud. They came in quiet, too quiet. I was in the barn, supposed to be on watch. I fell asleep. The admission was a stone in his own throat. I woke to Ellie screaming. They had her. One of them had his hand over her mouth. They were taking her as a shield, to make sure Pa and I didn't shoot while they made off with the horses." He stopped, the memory a physical thing, choking him. "I had my rifle. I had a clear shot at one of them, but I froze. I saw her eyes, so scared. I was afraid I'd hit her, afraid of the noise, afraid of what they'd do. I just stood there. Pa came out firing and they fired back. They dropped her and fled. The flat stone in his hand cracked under the pressure of his grip." "She wasn't hit by their bullets," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. She was trampled. When they bolted, by the time I got to her, it was too late. All I could do was listen to her stop breathing. He threw the broken stone. It skipped once, twice, and disappeared into the sagebrush. Ever since then, he finished, looking back at her, his face a mask of old pain. I've been terrified of being too late, of hearing a cry for help and not being fast enough, or strong enough, to answer. Now their truths lay between them. Two wounded animals revealed in the harsh, clarifying light. She saw his failure, and he saw her accusation. They were both fugitives, one from the law, the other from his own memory. Mara rose slowly from the ground and walked toward him. She stopped so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. The air was filled with the scent of the desert-dried dust, the sharp resin of juniper, and the faint, smoky smell of old ashes from his stove. She looked at his hand, the one that had crushed the stone, still clenched into a tight fist at his side. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on the back of his. Her touch was impossibly light, yet it felt as if it had the weight of an anchor, holding him steady. It was not a gesture of pity, but of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the wound he had just shown her. He looked down at her hand on his. Her skin was a warm brown against his own sun-weathered hide. He thought of the words scrawled on the warrant half-breed widow, a dismissal, a condemnation. He met her gaze, and for the first time, allowed himself to truly see the woman before him, not just the victim he had rescued. He saw the strength that had kept her alive, the defiance that had made her refuse to sell her land, the courage it had taken to tell her story. "I don't care about the color of a person's skin," he said, the words coming out low and certain. "I care about the thing that breathes beneath it." Her eyelids fluttered and closed. It was a small movement, but it was a surrender of a kind. A moment of trust in a world that had given her every reason to trust no one. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the day they found her. In that moment, the space between them vanished. It was not a decision, but an inevitability, like two rivers converging. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not born of passion or romance, but of something far more elemental survival. It was short, chaste, and profoundly honest. It tasted of dust, of sorrow, and of the shared, desperate need for human connection. It was a quiet statement that they were both still alive, here, under the vast and indifferent sky. It asked for nothing and promised nothing, yet, in its simplicity, it was everything. A sound, sharp and clear, sliced through the moment. It was the whistle of a bird, but no bird he knew. High-pitched, two short notes followed by a long one. It echoed from the direction of Coyote Narrows, a signal cutting through the stillness. Almost immediately, it was answered by the distant, rhythmic drumming of approaching horses. More than one. Beck reacted instantly. He grabbed her arm, his touch no longer gentle but urgent, and pulled her back with him into the deep shadows thrown by the barn. The intimacy of the moment was shattered, replaced by the cold, sharp-edged reality of their situation. They pressed themselves against the rough, sun-warmed wood of the barn wall, their bodies tense, their senses straining. They both knew what that sound meant. It was not the army. It was not a lone lawman. That was the sound of a posse, a vigilante company, the kind of men who dealt in rope and rough justice, the kind of men who would have left her hanging from that tree, the sound of Tolland Graves's men. Mara's breath was hot and fast against his neck. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his back. She shifted, turning to face him in the narrow space. She placed her hand flat against the center of his chest, her fingers splayed over his heart, her eyes, wide and dark in the shadows, locked onto his. For the first time since he'd found her, she made a request, a plea. Her voice was a raw whisper, packed with the terror of all she had endured and all she feared was to come. "Don't leave me behind." He looked down at her, at the fierce, desperate hope in her eyes, at the small, determined hand pressed against his chest. He saw the starling pierced by thorns, still fighting, still trying to find its song. He gave her no verbal promise, no empty vow. He simply held her gaze and nodded. Once, a short, sharp dip of his chin. It was a promise forged in shared pain, sealed in a moment of stolen tenderness, and now hardened into a vow of action. It was a pact made without a single word, and in the silence of the barn's shadow, with the sound of approaching death on the wind, it was more binding than any oath sworn on a Bible. The sound of the approaching horses was a drumbeat, growing steadily from a distant tremor in the earth to a clear, rhythmic pounding that vibrated in Beck's bones. He pushed Mara deeper into the shadows of the barn, his hand a firm, protective pressure on her back. "Inside," he whispered, a command that needed no explanation. "Stay away from the window. Don't make a sound." She slipped through the barn door into the hay-scented gloom without a word, a ghost disappearing into a deeper shadow. Beck stepped out from the lee of the barn and walked with a steady, unhurried gait to his cabin's small porch. He didn't draw his Colt, but he unfastened the leather thong that held it in the holster. He stopped on the top step, turned, and leaned against one of the posts, crossing his ankles as if he had all the time in the world. He was a picture of weary indifference, a man at rest on his own property, but his body was a coiled spring. His eyes narrowed against the glare, watching the three riders as they came to a halt just beyond his fence line. The man in the center was Tolland Graves. Beck knew him by reputation, a man who had once been a Texas Ranger before he discovered that selling justice was far more profitable than enforcing it. He was lean and wiry, with a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't conceal the cruel set of his mouth. He wore a clean duster and rode a fine black gelding, but it was his eyes that held your attention. They were the color of a washed-out sky, pale and cold, and they missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who measured everything and everyone in terms of profit and loss. The two men who flanked him were of a different sort. They were hard-faced and silent, their clothes caked with the dust of a dozen territories. They sat their horses with a predatory stillness, their hands resting on their thighs, never far from the butts of their pistols. They were not deputies or lawmen. They were tools, and Graves was the hand that wielded them. Graves swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and confident. He left his rifle in its scabbard but didn't unbutton his duster. He walked to the porch, his spurs ringing a cheerful, deadly tune in the quiet afternoon. He stopped at the bottom step, looking up at Beck. "Cole," he said. It wasn't a question. "Heard you took up ranchin'. Heard you took up botherin' folks," Beck replied, his voice level. A thin smile touched Graves' lips but never reached his cold eyes. "A man's got to make a living. Some of us do it with cattle, others with retrieval." He let the word hang in the air. "I'm here on behalf of the Rio Seco Syndicate, a business matter. My business is my own," Beck said. "And you're standing on it. State yours and be on your way." Graves's smile widened a fraction. He enjoyed this. "The syndicate holds the charter for the water rights along Coyote Spring," he said, his tone reasonable, like a patient teacher explaining a simple lesson. "It's a matter of progress, of bringing the railroad through, of civilizing this dusty patch of God's earth. The water is theirs, all of it." He paused, his gaze flicking toward the silent cabin. "There was an unfortunate incident, a bit of sabotage. A widow woman, Mara Ellison, was implicated. The syndicate, being a benevolent entity, simply wants to resolve the matter. They want their spring and the woman who caused the trouble." He looked directly at Beck, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. "Coyote Spring belongs to the syndicate. Cole, the widow is just delaying what must happen. There's a bounty, a generous one. For her return, I'm just here to collect." Beck pushed himself off the post, the simple movement full of a quiet menace. His hand now rested on the worn wooden grip of his peacemaker. His gaze was flat, unreadable. "There's no one here," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry over the whisper of the wind. "Nobody but goats and ghosts." Graves's eyes narrowed. He sniffed the air, a subtle, animalistic gesture. He could smell the lingering scent of wood smoke from a stove that had been used more recently than a lone man would require. He could see 2 sets of faint footprints in the dust near the cabin door. His gaze moved from Beck's impassive face to the closed cabin door, and a flicker of something calculation. Certainty passed through his pale eyes. He knew, but he also knew Beck Cole's reputation. A man who kept to himself, but who was dangerously fast and utterly stubborn when pushed. Starting a gunfight here and now, with just 2 men against a man fortified on his own land, was poor odds. It wasn't profitable. Graves held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right, Cole. Ghosts it is. He turned and walked back to his horse, his spurs suddenly sounding less cheerful. He swung into the saddle and looked back, his face no longer smiling. The mask of civility was gone, replaced by the cold promise of violence. "We'll be back," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "Tomorrow night, with more men who ain't so worried about ghosts." He wheeled his horse, and his 2 silent companions followed suit. They rode away, not looking back, their departure as sudden as their arrival. Beck stood on the porch and watched until they were gone, until the dust had settled and the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. He waited another 10 minutes, scanning the horizon, before he finally went back inside. Mara was pressed against the far wall, a pale figure in the gloom, her knuckles white where she gripped her own arms. "They're gone," he said. "For now. Later." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red, Beck saddled his mare. He didn't tell Mara where he was going. He just took a spade from the barn and rode out, heading back toward the old cottonwood at Sagebrush Ferry. He found the place just as he had left it. The severed rope still dangled from the limb, and there, half buried in the dust, was the crude wooden sign. He dismounted, pulled it from the earth, and read the hateful words one last time: "No mercy for water thieves." He tied the plank to his saddle and rode back to his cabin in the gathering dusk. In the swept-clean yard behind the cabin, he dug a shallow hole. He tossed the sign into it and began to shovel the dirt back in, burying the unjust sentence, erasing the words that had condemned a woman without a trial. It was a futile gesture. He knew. The verdict was still out there, in the minds of men like Graves, but it was a necessary one. He built a small fire in the stone-lined pit he used for cooking. He didn't need the warmth, but he needed the light, a small bastion against the encroaching darkness. He was staring into the flames when he felt a presence beside him. Mara had come out of the cabin, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stood next to him, her shoulder almost touching his, and watched the fire with him. She held out her hand. In her palm was the bird she had drawn in the dust, a small effigy she had carved from a piece of scrap wood with his skinning knife, a starling, pierced with thorns. Without a word, she tossed it into the fire. They watched together as the flames licked at the small wooden carving. The thorns blackened and disappeared first. Then the wings curled, turning to glowing embers. The bird's body held its shape for a long moment before it finally collapsed into a pile of white-hot ash. The smoke rose from the fire, a thin gray plume that drifted up into the night sky, spiraling like a soul being set free. They stood there until the last ember had died, the silence between them no longer a thing of tension, but of shared understanding. Inside the cabin, the single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was cool now. Beck took a piece of charcoal from the stove and, on the surface of the rough plank table, he began to draw a map. He sketched the familiar lines of his own property, then the winding path of Juniper Draw. His hand moved with certainty, drawing the tangled network of trails and arroyos that crisscrossed the territory. He drew the thin ribbon of Mesquite Wash, a dangerous but direct route south. He sketched the narrow, rock-strewn passage of Dead Colt Canyon, a place where a man on foot could lose any pursuit on horseback. And finally, he drew the low, unmarked pass that led over the foothills and into the vast, protective shadow of the Sierra Blanca Mountains. He looked up at Mara, who was watching him, her face intent in the lantern light. "If we're going," he said, his voice low and final, "it has to be tonight." She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask where or how or what their chances were. She had already made her decision, long before he had drawn the map. She simply nodded. "Yes." He stood and went to the small, locked chest where he kept his possessions. He took out a revolver. It was not a big army pistol like his own, but a smaller, more elegant weapon. A Smith Wesson Model 2 with a clean silver finish and a pearl handle. It had been his mother's. He checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded. He held it out to Mara. "But first, do you know how to use this?" She looked at the gun, then at him. "My husband taught me." She took the revolver from him. He expected her hand to shake, to feel the alien weight of the weapon, but her fingers closed around the pearl grip with a steady, resolute firmness. There was no tremor. The woman who had hung helpless from a tree was gone. In her place was a survivor, a woman who was ready to fight, as if on cue. A new sound reached them from the darkness outside. It was faint, carried on the night wind, but unmistakable. A rhythmic, metallic thump, thump, thump. The sound of a sledgehammer driving spikes into wood. Beck moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "They're not waiting," he said, his voice grim. "That's coming from the pass, the syndicate. They're building a checkpoint, a gate, to control who comes and goes, to control the water." The time for planning was over. The world was closing in. The escape routes being sealed off one by one. They moved with a quiet, desperate efficiency. Beck went to the barn and saddled both his mare and the sturdy pack mule. He loaded the mule with a sack of oats, 2 full canteens, a box of cartridges, and the small amount of dried food he had. Inside, Mara gathered what she could, the blanket from the cot, the remaining strips of clean cloth. They met by the cabin door. The horses stood ready, their breath misting in the cool night air. The cabin behind them was dark, but the stove was still warm. They left the door slightly ajar, a silent testament to their hasty departure, a ghost of the life that had briefly, impossibly, flickered within its walls. They mounted up and were about to move out when the wind shifted. It was a subtle change, the breeze now coming from the east instead of the north, and it carried a new scent. Not the clean, sharp smell of juniper and dust, but the acrid, unmistakable smell of smoke. Beck looked toward the eastern ridges, and his blood ran cold. He saw it then, a faint, orange glow against the black silhouette of the hills, and then another, further to the south, and another. They were small fires, dotted along the landscape. They weren't meant to burn the range. They were markers. Barriers. "Graves," Mara whispered, her voice tight with understanding. Beck nodded, his face a grim mask in the starlight. "He's not just coming back with more men," he said. "He's herding us, setting fires to push us away from the easy routes, to funnel us exactly where he wants us to go." They were trapped. The gate was being built ahead of them, and a wall of fire was rising behind them. The vast, open desert had suddenly become a cage, and the bars were closing in. There was no time for a second thought. Beck spurred his mare forward, pulling the mule's lead rope tight, plunging them away from the faint firelight and into the vast, swallowing darkness of the desert. The moon, a sliver of polished bone, offered just enough light to turn the landscape into a treacherous world of silver and shadow. The familiar shapes of Cholla and Yucca became monstrous. Grasping silhouettes, the ground, a patchwork of sand and sharp rock, was a constant threat. Their only ally was the terrain. Beck led them not along the trails, but across them, using the long, sloping backs of the dunes as cover. They rode in the troughs between the waves of sand, their passage a silent, desperate scramble. The wind was a constant companion, a physical force that pushed against them and did its best to scour their tracks from the earth. Mara rode close behind him, a small, determined shadow. The silver Smith Wesson now tucked into the sash of her dress. She did not complain. She did not falter. She simply rode, her focus absolute. her trust in him a heavy weight on his shoulders. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the fires. But Beck knew Graves was not a man to be easily outrun. He was a hunter, and he was using the fire not just to herd them, but to read the land. Graves would know which paths were cut off, which routes remained. He would anticipate. Their path inevitably led them toward Coyote Narrows, the very place the signal whistle had come from. It was a deep, winding canyon carved by a ghost of a river, the only viable passage through a jagged spine of rock that separated the flats from the high desert. It was also a perfect trap. Beck reined in his horse at the mouth of the canyon, the silence within its towering rock walls a stark contrast to the wind-swept plains behind them. "We go through on foot," he said, his voice low. "Lead the animals, stay close to the walls, and stay quiet." They dismounted, the sudden stillness of the earth under their boots a relief and a new source of tension. Beck took the reins of his mare, and Mara took the mules. They entered the Narrows, plunging into a darkness that was almost absolute. The moonlight could not penetrate this deep, and they were forced to feel their way forward, their hands brushing against the cold, rough surface of the canyon walls. The only sounds were the soft scuff of their boots on the sandy floor and the occasional clink of a horseshoe on a loose stone, a noise that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the profound silence. They were halfway through when the world exploded. A muzzle flash, a brilliant, blinding orange flower, bloomed high on the canyon rim above them. The crack of the rifle shot was instantaneous, a physical blow that slammed into them, echoing and re-echoing between the narrow walls, making it impossible to tell where it had come from. Beck didn't think. He reacted with a guttural roar. He shoved Mara with all his strength. She stumbled, falling hard against the canyon wall as a second muzzle flash lit the darkness. In that same instant, he felt a white-hot poker slam into his left side, just above his hip. It was a vicious, tearing impact that stole his breath and spun him around. He heard a sound like cloth ripping, followed by the warm, shockingly wet gush of his own blood. The strength went out of his legs, and he crumpled to his knees, his mare shying violently away from him. "Beck!" Mara's voice was a sharp cry in the ringing silence. Another shot kicked up a spray of sand just inches from his head. He could hear the whine of the bullet as it ricocheted off the far wall. They were exposed, sitting ducks. Mara scrambled toward him, her movements low and desperate. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "Get up," she hissed, pulling him. "Get up!" He tried, but his left side was a universe of fire. He could feel the blood, hot and slick, soaking through his shirt and pants. He managed to get one foot under him before another shot rang out. This time he heard the angry thwack as the bullet buried itself in the pack on the mule's back. The poor animal brayed in terror and bolted, its lead rope ripping through Mara's grasp as it galloped blindly down the canyon. "The rocks!" he gasped, pointing toward a dark cleft in the canyon wall a few yards away. She didn't hesitate, half dragging, half carrying him. She pulled him into the shallow rock alcove. They collapsed together behind a large boulder, their bodies pressed against the cold, damp stone. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, ozone, and the coppery scent of his blood. Their breathing was a ragged, frantic duet. He could feel her heart hammering against his arm. They were alive, for now. "How bad?" she whispered, her hands already fumbling at his side. "It went through," he grunted. "The pain a nauseating wave. Clean, I think." In the faint, reflected moonlight, she tore at his shirt. She ripped away the blood-soaked fabric to expose the wound. There was an exit wound, ragged and bleeding just as freely as the entrance. It was a deep, brutal furrow through the flesh of his side, but it seemed to have missed bone. Mara looked at the wound, then at her own patched dress. There was no hesitation. She gripped the hem of her dusty outer skirt, the one piece of clothing that defined her as a respectable widow, and with a single, violent motion, she ripped a long, wide strip from it. The sound of the tearing fabric was a small, defiant act of destruction in the face of the larger violence that surrounded them. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady in the gloom. She folded the cloth into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the entrance wound. He let out a choked gasp of pain. "Hold this," she commanded. "Hard." He pressed his hand over hers, the pressure excruciating but necessary. She ripped another, longer strip from her dress and began to wrap it tightly around his waist, creating a crude but effective pressure bandage. Her movements were efficient, impersonal, the actions of a person focused solely on the task of survival. She was not a nurse tending a patient. She was a soldier keeping her partner in the fight. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her breathing still ragged. "We can't stay here." "I know," he said, his voice tight with pain. "They're up there, both sides. I think pinned us." Another shot rang out, chipping fragments of rock from the boulder they were hiding behind. They both flinched. "Give me the pistol," Beck said. She looked at him, then at the small, silver Smith Wesson in her sash. "No," she said. "Mara. You can't hold it steady," she stated. A simple, irrefutable fact. "And we have maybe a dozen rounds between us. We can't waste them?" She pulled the revolver from her sash, the pearl grip a pale gleam in the darkness. She checked the action, her movements sure. "You know this canyon. You know the way the sound travels. You tell me where to shoot." He stared at her. The terrified woman he had cut down from the tree was gone. In her place was a stranger with cold, hard eyes and a voice that held the unyielding ring of command. In that moment, their roles were reversed. He was the wounded, and she was the protector. "All right," he breathed, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He leaned his head against the rock, closing his eyes for a second, listening past the ringing in his ears. He listened to the echo of the last shot, tracing its path in his mind. "There's one on the right rim, behind a cluster of rocks that looks like a fist. The other is on the left, further back, on a higher ledge." "I can't see them," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "They think they have us trapped. They'll get impatient. Just make them keep their heads down." She crawled to the edge of the boulder, the small revolver held tight in a two-handed grip. "Ready?" "The one on the right. Fire just over the top of the fist," he instructed. She took a deep breath, aimed, and fired. The sharp crack of the small pistol was a stark contrast to the boom of the rifles, but the effect was immediate. A rifle shot answered her instantly, but it was wild, fired in haste. "Good," he grunted. "Now reload that chamber. Count your shots. The other one. Left side. Aim for the sky just above the ledge. The flash will blind him for a second." She fired again. Another angry rifle shot answered, the bullet screaming high over their heads. They had bought themselves a few seconds. "Our mare is still out there," he said. "If we can reach her, the dry wash runs parallel to the canyon about 50 yards to the west. If we can get into it, they'll lose our tracks." He looked at her, his face pale in the gloom. "I'm going to draw their fire. When I shoot, you run for the horse. Don't wait for me." "No," she said again, her voice fierce. "We go together." He saw the absolute resolve in her eyes and knew it was useless to argue. He pulled his own heavy Colt, the effort making him dizzy. "All right," he said. "Together." He pointed his pistol at the canyon wall, high above the gunman on the right. "On 3. I'll make some noise. You run." He didn't wait for her to agree. 1, 2, 3. He fired. He didn't aim at the man, but at the sheer rock face 10 feet above him. The heavy .45 caliber slug struck the stone with a tremendous impact, shattering the rock and sending a shower of sharp-edged fragments down onto the shooter's position. He heard a cry of surprise and pain from above. In that instant of confusion, Mara broke from cover. She ran, low and fast, a fleeting shadow in the moonlight. Beck pushed himself up, his wounded side screaming in protest, and staggered after her. His vision swam, the canyon walls tilting at a sickening angle. He saw Mara reach the mare, her hands grabbing the reins, her voice a low, soothing murmur to the terrified animal. He stumbled, his legs giving way, and fell to one knee. A rifle fired from the ledge on the left. The bullet kicked up dirt a foot from his head. But Mara was already there. She fired the Smith Wesson back up at the muzzle flash. A small, defiant answer. She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "Come on, Beck, come on." Somehow, he found the strength. He hauled himself into the saddle, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through him. Mara swung up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him steady. She kicked the mare into a desperate gallop, plunging them deeper into the darkness of the canyon. They rode for their lives, expecting a bullet in the back at any second, but none came. Beck's trick with the ricochet had bought them the precious seconds they needed. They cleared the end of the narrows and turned sharply west, finding the shallow, sandy bed of the dry wash he had spoken of. They urged the mare down into it, the soft sand muffling the sound of their escape, swallowing their tracks. They followed the winding path of the wash for what felt like an eternity. The adrenaline began to fade, and Beck's pain returned with a vengeance. He slumped forward in the saddle, his consciousness starting to fray at the edges. He was losing too much blood. They reached a place where the wash widened, a small clearing of stunted piñon trees known as Piñon Cut. He could go no further. He slid from the saddle, landing in a heap on the ground. Mara was off the horse in an instant, kneeling beside him. "Beckett," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. She unstrapped his canteen from the saddle and held it to his lips. "Drink." He shook his head. "You," he managed to rasp. "It's the last. My share comes later," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She tilted the canteen, forcing the cool, life-giving water past his cracked lips. "We live first. You hear me? We live." He drank, the water easing the fire in his throat. He leaned back against the trunk of a piñon, his breathing shallow. He felt cold, so cold, despite the mild night. He looked up at Mara, in the pale moonlight. He could see the dirt and blood smeared on her face, the fierce, protective light in her eyes. She followed his gaze, looking back toward the east, toward the direction they had come. On the black rim of the distant mesas, a new light had appeared, a series of moving, flickering orange dots. "Torches. Graves," he whispered. "They're a long way off," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "But they won't give up." He knew she was right. They had escaped the trap. But the hunter was still on their trail. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to obey. A wave of blackness washed over him. "I can't," he began. "Yes, you can," she said softly, but with a core of steel. She stood up and went to the mare, taking the reins. She walked back and looked down at him. "You saved my life back there at the tree. Now it's my turn. I'm not leaving you behind." She offered him her hand. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a groan, he took it. She pulled, and using the tree for leverage, he managed to get to his feet, swaying like a drunkard. He looked at her, confused. Where are we going?" Her face was grim in the moonlight. "Back," she said. "He thinks he's chasing us south. He's wrong." She looked at him, her gaze intense. "There's something you hid. Isn't there something at the cabin? Something you were willing to die for?" He just stared at her, astonished at her perception. She didn't wait for an answer. She looped the reins over her arm and began to walk, leading the horse, forcing him to follow. Her steps were slow but steady, her back straight, a small, solitary figure of impossible strength, leading a wounded man through a hostile land. It took them the rest of the night, a grueling, agonizing journey that was a blur of pain and exhaustion for Beck. He clung to the saddle horn, drifting in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady, rhythmic plod of the horse and the small, determined figure of the woman leading them onward. Just before dawn, they crested a familiar rise. Below them, nestled in the gray, pre-dawn light, was the dark, silent shape of his own cabin and barn. They had come full circle. The place they had fled was now their only destination. They approached the barn from the rear, moving like ghosts in the half-light. Mara helped him dismount, and he leaned heavily against the warm, solid wood of the barn wall. "Where?" she whispered. He pointed to a loose floorboard in the corner of the empty horse stall. "Under there," while he kept a watch, his Colt heavy in his trembling hand. Mara pried up the board. She reached into the dark, cool space beneath, and her fingers closed around a long, cylindrical object. She pulled it out. It was a tube of thick, oiled leather, sealed at both ends with wax. It was heavy, solid. She held it out to him. He took it, his fingers tracing the familiar contours. Jacob Ellison's grandfather got this from the Spanish governor, before this was even a territory, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's the original deed, the grant for Coyote Spring and all the land it touches. It's their real right to the water. It was not just a piece of paper. It was the truth, and in a land ruled by lies and force, the truth was the only weapon they had left. It was the reason he had gone back, the reason they were here. It was their only hope." The hard-packed earth behind the cabin felt like the only still point in a turning world. The night was vast, silent, and cold. The moon, now past its zenith, cast long, skeletal shadows from the gnarled juniper trees. The wind, which had died down in the hours after midnight, began to breathe again. It was a different wind from the one that had chased them. This one was cooler, cleaner, carrying the high, sharp scent of pinon pine from the distant hills, mixed with the faint, metallic smell of cold cinders from their long dead fire pit. The ground itself, swept clean by 1,000 days of wind, was soft and fine, a blanket of dust over the unyielding earth. Beckett Cole stood in this pocket of stillness, his body braced against the rough wood of the barn wall. In his hand, he clutched the heavy, oiled leather tube that held their only hope, the adrenaline that had carried him through the canyon, that had fueled their desperate return, had finally seeped away, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. He felt the pain in his side not as a sharp tear, but as a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pull all the warmth from his body. A shiver seized him, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in his wounded hip and racked his entire frame. He had not heard Mara approach. She had been standing in the shadows, watching him, her own stillness a mirror of his. She saw the tremor, saw the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the leather tube. She moved behind him, her boots making no sound in the soft dust. She didn't speak. She didn't ask if he was all right. She simply pressed her body against his back, sliding her arms around his waist, her hands covering his own where they were clasped at his stomach. Her warmth was a shock. It was a small, stubborn, living thing against the vast, cold emptiness of the night. He had been so alone, for so long, that the simple, solid presence of another human being felt alien and profound. He let out a ragged breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Her warmth was an anchor, and in its grip, his frantic, shallow breathing began to slow, to deepen, to unconsciously match the steady, quiet rise and fall of her own. She pressed her face into the space between his shoulder and his neck, her hair brushing against his jaw. Her whisper was so soft it was almost just a breath, a vibration more felt than heard. "You are not alone anymore." Beckett. The words undid him. A lifetime of solitude, of carrying the weight of his own failures, of standing guard against a world that took everything it all seemed to crack. The iron-hard tension in his shoulders, the rigid posture he had held since he was 17 years old. It simply dissolved. He let his head fall back, his weight settling against her, and for a long moment, he just let her hold him up. He was a wounded man, and she was his shield. He winced as the movement pulled at the makeshift bandage on his side. It was stiff, soaked through with drying blood. "We need to look at this," she said, her voice still quiet but gaining a new, practical edge. She unwrapped her arms and moved to face him. "Sit, before you fall." He obeyed, sliding down the wall of the barn until he was sitting on the cold earth, in the pale moonlight. She knelt in front of him, her face a mask of concentration. She gently peeled back the torn, bloody fabric of his shirt and examined the bandages she had applied in the canyon. They were crude, saturated. "I need more cloth," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She looked at her own dress. The thin, patched calico was already torn from where she had ripped the first set of bandages. It was hopelessly grimed with dust and his own blood. Over it, she wore a heavier, darker outer skirt, a practical garment of sturdy wool, now caked with the mud of the arroyo and the dust of their long ride. It was a hindrance, a heavy, sodden memory of a life that was no longer hers. With a decisive, practical movement, she untied the waistband. The heavy garment fell in a heap around her ankles. She stepped out of it, leaving her standing in her lighter, more functional cotton underskirt and bodice. The change was not one of immodesty, but of purpose. She was shedding a skin that no longer fit, stripping herself down to the essentials needed for the fight ahead. She picked up the heavy wool skirt and, without a moment's hesitation, tore a long, clean strip from the inner lining fabric that was untouched by the filth of their journey. Then she folded the rest of the thick, heavy material into a dense, dark cushion. "Lie back," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "This will keep the dust off you and off the wound." She helped him ease back onto the folded skirt, her hands supporting his head until it rested on the makeshift pillow. The fabric was softer than the hard ground, a small, unexpected comfort. He let out a sigh, his body finally surrendering to its exhaustion. She didn't move away. The work of bandaging could wait a moment. The world had shrunk to this small patch of ground, to the silver light of the moon, and to the presence of the woman kneeling beside him. Instead, she lay down on the soft earth at his side, her body parallel to his, a few inches of space between them. This was not a fall. It was a settling, a mutual grounding. His hand, trembling slightly from the cold, moved in the dust, searching. Hers met it halfway. Her fingers were cool but strong, and they laced with his. It was a caress of reassurance, a silent, "I am here," a promise that held more weight than any spoken vow. They lay like that for a long time, listening to the vast, empty silence of the high desert. The moon, now beginning its descent, filtered through the gnarled, lace-like branches of the old juniper above them. It painted them in shifting patterns of silver light and deep shadow, their shoulders and faces a constantly changing mosaic. Their shared breath was the only sound, a quiet, rhythmic language that spoke of fear, of pain, and of a strange, fragile connection. He turned his head on the makeshift pillow. She was already looking at him. Her eyes, in the moonlight, were dark, deep pools, and in them, he saw not the victim he had rescued, but the survivor who had, in turn, rescued him. The kiss that followed was as slow and inevitable as the rising of the moon. It was tentative at first, a question silently asked and silently answered. He felt her hand tighten on his, and he moved his other hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing the dust from her cheekbone. It deepened, no longer tasting of dust and the metallic tang of survival, but of something new, something that lived beneath the fear. It tasted of warmth and of a desperate, frightening hope. It was a kiss that acknowledged the abyss they were perched over and defied it. He shifted slightly, trying to get closer, and a sharp, electric pain from his wounded side made him gasp, breaking the kiss. A small, awkward laugh, barely a puff of air, escaped her. It was a sound so out of place in their grim reality that it was startling. "You are terrible at this," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "So are you," he whispered back, and the profound, simple honesty of it made them both smile in the darkness. She moved closer, shifting onto her side to face him. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing. The world vanished. There was no cold, no pain, no Tallinn graves, no dawn. There was only this single, profound point of contact. He could feel her eyelashes, damp against his skin. He breathed in the scent of her, a smell of dust, clean sweat, and the faint, lost scent of the woman she had been. He breathed her name, just once, holding the leather tube against his chest with one hand, his other hand still holding hers. "Mara!" It was not a plea or a call. It was a statement of fact, a prayer of thanks, a charm whispered in the dark against the coming of the light. They lay tangled together, a complicated knot of arms and legs, sharing what little warmth they had. He pulled the remnants of his canvas jacket from his own shoulders and draped it over her, and she, in turn, pulled the thin blanket she had taken from the cot up to his chin. They huddled against the cold, two survivors finding safety in the simple, honest presence of the other. It was an intimacy born of shared fate, not of sudden passion, and it was more powerful for it. They had breached the boundaries of their solitude and found not danger, but sanctuary. As the night deepened toward its end, the wind shifted again, this time bringing the true, sharp chill that precedes the dawn. Beck shivered, the cold seeping into his bones, and the pain in his side returned as a dull, heavy, insistent ache. Mara sensed the change in him immediately. She pushed herself up on one elbow. "We can't stay on the ground," she said, her voice losing its soft, nocturnal quality, regaining its sharp edge of command. "You'll freeze." She helped him sit up, his back resting against the solid, comforting wood of the cabin wall. The folded skirt still provided a cushion against the hard ground. She adjusted his shirt, her movements deft and impersonal, pulling the fabric together to cover his chest, as if dressing a child. Before he could speak, to thank her or to protest, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his once more. It was a brief, gentle kiss, almost chaste. It was not the seeking, desperate kiss of before, but one of comfort and quiet resolve, a promise. It was as soft and final as warm ash left over from a fire. She sat beside him, her back against the wall, her shoulder pressed firmly against his. They stared out at the eastern horizon. A faint, pearlescent line was beginning to form, a crack in the darkness, separating the earth from the sky. They sat in silence, two orphans, one of family, one of justice who had found a strange and desperate solace in each other. There were no more secrets between them, no more hiding. They had chosen. The first ray of sunlight, thin and sharp as a knife, struck the high mesas, painting their peaks a bloody, brilliant red. The light crept down the mountainside, illuminating the vast, empty desert floor, and finally, it touched the patch of ground where they sat. It illuminated the leather tube lying in his lap. The sight of it, stark and real in the morning light, broke the spell. The softness of the night receded, replaced by the hard, sharp-edged reality of the coming day. Mara looked at him. Her eyes were clear, focused, and all the vulnerability of the night was gone. He looked back, and she saw the same change in him. The pain was still there, etched in the lines around his mouth, but the weakness was gone. In its place was a familiar, grim determination. They were no longer just a man and a woman huddled in the dark. They were partners. They were a team, and the fight for their lives and for the water was about to begin. The harsh light of dawn brought not clarity, but a new, more urgent kind of fear, huddled in the dubious shelter of the barn, with the vast, hostile territory waking around them. The leather tube in Beck's hands felt less like a weapon and more like a final, desperate prayer. The warmth of the previous night was a ghost, a half-remembered dream. Now, there was only the cold reality of their situation. They were wounded, hunted, and holding a piece of paper against an army of guns and money. Inside the dim, hay-scented light of the cabin, Mara carefully cleaned and redressed Beck's wound with the last of the clean cloth. Her movements were precise, her touch gentle but firm, her face a mask of concentration. Beck sat on the edge of the cot, enduring the sharp, cleansing sting of the whiskey she used to sterilize the wound. His gaze fixed on the leather tube on the table. "It's not enough," he said, his voice a low rasp. "A piece of paper from a Spanish governor won't stop Silas Drummond. His men won't even be able to read it. They'll use it to light a cigar." When Mara was finished, her hands stained with his blood, she came to the table. "Then what is in there?" she asked, her voice laced with an exhaustion that went deeper than their night-long flight. Beck worked the wax seal loose with his thumbnail, and carefully slid the contents out onto the rough plank tabletop. The primary document was a sheet of thick, yellowed parchment, covered in the elegant, looping script of a Spanish colonial official, brittle with age and importance. This was the original land grant, the deed to Coyote Spring, but rolled inside it was another, newer document. It was a surveyor's map, drawn in the meticulous, angular hand of an American cartographer, dated just 10 years prior. It had been commissioned by Mara's father-in-law. The lines were drawn in a faded but still clear blue ink, marking the spring, the homestead, and the precise boundaries of the Ellison property as defined by the original grant. Mara leaned closer, tracing the blue lines with her finger. "This is our land," she whispered. "Yes," Beck said, his own finger moving to a series of faint pencil markings on the map's edge. "And this is what Drummond built." The pencil lines showed the syndicate's new dam, their reservoir, their diversion channels. They were like a parasite, a crude new anatomy drawn over the old, true one. And the boundaries were wrong. The syndicate's pencil marks claimed a full quarter-mile of Ellison land, including the high ground that fed the spring its water. Drummond hadn't just stolen their water. He had redrawn the world to make the theft look legal. "He has his own papers," Mara said, her voice hollow. "He showed them to Jacob. They had official seals from the territorial board. He claimed our deed was an old, invalid relic." Beck stared at the map, at the confident blue ink and the arrogant pencil lines. A piece was missing. A forged deed could be exposed, but only by comparing it to the original. Drummond would never allow that. They needed another point of reference, an independent, official record that Drummond couldn't have controlled. His mind raced, sifting through the legal machinery of the territory, the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy that even men like Drummond had to navigate. And then it came to him, a memory, surfacing like a bubble from the depths of a muddy pond, a trip he'd made to Red Mesa 2 years ago to register the bill of sale for a bull. "The notary," he said, his voice sharp with sudden excitement. "When Jacob died, he left you the land in his will." "Yes," Mara nodded. "Yes, we filed the papers with the circuit judge, but everything must be recorded. It has to be recorded by a public notary," Beck finished, his mind moving faster now, the pieces clicking into place, the official town ledger. "When you inherited the property, you would have had to sign the ledger, accepting the transfer of the deed. Jacob's signature would have been on the previous page, from when he inherited it. That ledger, it's a public record. Drummond's forged deed would have a forged signature, but the notary's book in Red Mesa, it will have Jacob's real signature, your real signature. If we can get that book, we can prove his documents are a lie." For the first time in days, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in Mara's eyes. It was a fragile, tentative spark of hope. "Red Mesa," she said, "but the town will be full of syndicate men, and the notary's office will be locked." "Not the notary's office," Beck corrected. "Men like Drummond don't trust a small-town notary with their business. The official records, the ledgers, the land titles, they're all kept in the secure storeroom at the Territorial Depot office, the post office." A plan, audacious and desperate, began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a gamble against impossible odds, but it was better than running. Running was a slow death. This was a chance, however slim, at life. "It has to be a two-pronged attack," he said, leaning over the table, his weariness forgotten. "We can't be seen together. You need an ally, someone with authority, someone people will listen to, someone they won't dare to shoot on sight." He looked at her. "When you and Jacob were married, who officiated Padre Madero," she said without hesitation, "at the San Isidro mission, he has known my family since my mother was a girl. He is a good man." "Good," Beck said. "That's your target. You go to him. You tell him you're alive. You tell him what Drummond has done. You ask for his help. His voice, in front of his congregation, is a weapon we don't have." "And you?" she asked. "The depot office," he replied, his jaw set. "I need to find a way to get the key to the records room." The following day, they put their plan into motion. They traveled separately, taking winding, indirect routes to Red Mesa. a bustling, dusty town that served as the hub for the entire region. Beck arrived first, his wounded side a constant, nagging pain. He left his mare at the livery and walked through the town, a stooped, anonymous figure in a dusty hat. He made his way to the saloon, the place where all the town's secrets were bought and sold for the price of a shot of whiskey. He found his man an hour later, a part-time mail carrier named Finn, a man whose love for the bottle was exceeded only by his love for gossip. Beck bought him a drink, then another, listening to him complain about the heat, the dust, and the overbearing authority of the depot master. Beck spun a story about a sweetheart, a girl he was finally going to marry, and the need to retrieve a family ring he'd had sent to the general delivery box. "The thing is," Beck said, leaning in conspiratorially, "the depot master thinks I'm a drifter. He won't let me near the place. But the box is in the back office. Finn, his eyes glassy, puffed out his chest. The back office is nothing," he slurred. "Just mail sacks and old papers." He fumbled inside his vest and produced a tarnished brass tag on a grimy leather thong. "This opens everything. The mailroom, the storeroom, even the privy." Beck feigned admiration. He told Finn he was a man of great importance. He bought him one more drink for the road. And as Finn staggered out into the blinding sunlight, Beck's hand deftly lifted the brass tag from his vest. He now had the key. Meanwhile, Mara, her head and face wrapped in a simple black shawl that made her look like any other grieving country widow, made her way to the cool, quiet adobe walls of the San Isidro mission. She found Padre Madero tending a small chili garden in the courtyard. He was an old man, his back bent, his skin the color and texture of a dried apricot. But his eyes, when he looked up and recognized her, were as bright and clear as a boy's. "Mara," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. He dropped his trowel and rushed to her, his old hands taking hers. "My child, we thought they said you were gone. They said you were lost." Tears streamed down Mara's face as she told him everything about Drummond, about the dam, about the murder charge, about the posse that had left her to die. The priest listened, his expression hardening from joyful relief to a cold, righteous anger. "Silas Drummond is a snake in our garden," the old priest said, his voice trembling with fury. "He comes to my church and puts money in the collection plate, but his hands are stained with the sins of greed. This cannot stand." He looked at Mara, his bright eyes full of a fierce, protective fire. "I cannot offer you sanctuary, my child. His power reaches even here, but I can offer you a voice. This Sunday, he is coming to town. There will be a ceremony in the plaza. He is to be given a contract from the territorial board, granting him control of all the water in the region." He squeezed her hands. "That is when we will act. I will stand before the people of Red Mesa, before God, and I will speak the truth. I will speak your name, Mara Ellison. They will know you are not a criminal. They will know you are a victim." The pieces were in place, the key and the voice. They met that evening in a deserted alleyway behind the blacksmith's shop, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. They shared what they had learned. The ceremony on Sunday. That was their deadline. That was their stage. For the next 2 days, they prepared. Beck traded his last few dollars for a rickety handcart and 2 sacks of salt from a freight driver. He would be a salt merchant, a common enough sight, his cart providing the perfect cover for his Spencer rifle and the precious leather tube. Mara acquired a few simple, dark garments, completing her disguise as a humble widow. In the dusty confines of Lariat Alley, they rehearsed. He showed her the map, the plan. He would enter the depot office during the commotion of the ceremony. He would retrieve the ledger. He would get it to her, at the mission church, which overlooked the plaza. She would give it to the priest. "It's too many steps," she said, her brow furrowed. "Too many chances for something to go wrong. It's the only way," he insisted. They practiced the handoff. He would pass the heavy ledger through the sacristy window at the back of the church. She would be waiting inside. They walked through the motions, a grim, silent ballet in the gathering dusk. At one point, he stumbled over a loose cobblestone, his wounded side protesting, and pitched forward. He would have fallen if she hadn't caught him. The sudden, awkward embrace, the absurdity of their situation, broke the tension. A small, choked laugh escaped her lips. And then he was laughing too. A low, rusty sound. For a moment, they were not fugitives, but just a man and a woman, clinging to each other and laughing in the dark. The night before the ceremony, they sat in the livery stable, hidden in the loft, the air thick with the sweet smell of hay and the sound of sleeping horses. The whole town was buzzing with anticipation for the arrival of Silas Drummond. Beck took a small, flat piece of kindling from his pocket. With the tip of his knife, he carefully carved her name into the soft wood, M-A-R-A. He handed it to her. She took the knife and, on the other side, carved his name, B-E-C-K. He took the wooden chip and unsealed the leather tube. He slid the small piece of wood inside, alongside the ancient Spanish deed and the surveyor's map. A small, tangible reminder of their pact. A message to whoever found it, if they failed. A promise that if they were separated, they would not be forgotten. He sealed the tube. Their hands touched as he did so. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The plan was made. All that remained was to see it through. Their hearts needed to be steadier than a rifleman's aim. Their resolve harder than the iron of the coming railroad. From far out on the plains, a sound drifted through the night. A long, mournful cry that echoed over the sleeping town. It was the whistle of the midnight train, heading east. But in the quiet darkness of the hayloft, it sounded like a bell, tolling for a judgment that was now only hours away. Sunday dawned hot and airless, the sky a bleached, unforgiving white. By midday, the central plaza of Red Mesa was a sea of humanity, a churning mix of ranchers in their Sunday best, miners with scrubbed faces, merchants, families, and a healthy number of dusty, curious drifters. A wooden platform had been erected in front of the courthouse, decorated with red, white, and blue bunting that already looked wilted in the oppressive heat. Atop it, a large, professionally painted banner proclaimed, "The Rio Seco Syndicate Progress and Prosperity for New Mexico." Silas Drummond stood on the platform as if he owned it, which, in a sense, he did. He was dressed in a fine black frock coat, his starched white shirt a beacon in the sun. He smiled, a wide, predatory expression of magnanimity, shaking hands with the territorial dignitaries who had come to witness his coronation. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable in his formal blue uniform, stood Lieutenant Avery Pike. His duty was to represent the authority of the United States government, to lend an air of official sanction to the proceedings. But his eyes were constantly scanning the crowd, his posture rigid, a man expecting trouble. On the dusty street that bordered the plaza, a stooped figure in a wide-brimmed hat pushed a rickety handcart laden with 2 heavy sacks of salt. Beckett Cole kept his head down, his movements slow and deliberate. Just another poor merchant trying to find a shady spot. No one gave him a second glance. The cart's squeaking wheels and his own pained, shuffling gait, a convincing performance aided by the very real agony in his side, made him invisible. He guided the cart into the narrow alley beside the Territorial Depot office, a sturdy brick building that baked in the afternoon sun. He was hidden from the plaza, but he could hear the drone of the speeches and the occasional polite smattering of applause. The ceremony had begun. Now, so had his. Leaving the cart, he slipped around to the rear of the building. The back door was solid oak. He pulled the grimy leather thong from his pocket. The tarnished brass tag felt heavy, a key to either salvation or the gallows. He slid it into the lock. For a heart-stopping moment, it refused to turn. He jiggled it, his hands slick with sweat, and then, with a low, grating click, the tumblers gave way. He pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it silently behind him. He was in the main mail room. Sacks of letters and parcels were piled high, the air thick with the smell of canvas, paper, and old ink. Sunlight streamed through the grimy front windows, illuminating dancing columns of dust. The real prize, however, lay beyond another door, this one reinforced with iron straps. The records room. The brass tag worked here too. The lock turned with a well-oiled smoothness. The room was a tomb of forgotten facts. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with thick, leather-bound ledgers, their spines stamped with dates stretching back decades. It was a library of every transaction, every birth, every death, every claim that had ever been officially recorded in Red Mesa. He scanned the shelves, his eyes moving quickly. 1874, 1875 there, 1876. He pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. It was thick, heavy as a tombstone, and smelled of dust and decaying leather. The cover was embossed with the words, Notary Public, Red Mesa District, 1876. A small, faded red wax seal held it shut. This was it. Back in the plaza, the speeches droned on. Silas Drummond was at the podium now, his voice a smooth, confident baritone, painting a glorious picture of a future brought by rail and regulated water, his regulated water. The crowd listened, their faces impassive, a mixture of hope, skepticism, and simple weariness. Then, a new sound cut through the hot, still air. A single, clear, resonant bell. Bong! It came from the San Isidro mission, its white adobe walls glowing in the sun on the north side of the plaza. Every head turned. The bell was not a call to worship. It was a summons. Bong! It rang again. A deep, solemn note that vibrated in the chest. Padre Madero, his simple brown cassock a stark contrast to Drummond's finery, appeared in the arched doorway of his church. He held the thick, braided bell rope in one hand. My children, his voice, though old, carried across the plaza, amplified by the silence that had fallen. The Honorable Mr. Drummond speaks of the future, but before we embrace the future, we must make peace with the truth of the past. He paused, letting his words sink in. Join me now in a prayer for truth, a prayer for the truth of the water that God has given us. It was a brilliant move. No one could refuse a call to prayer. Murmurs ran through the crowd as they turned, their attention shifting from the political stage of the platform to the spiritual one of the church. Drummond's smile tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at being upstaged. As the crowd's focus shifted, a figure emerged from the shadows of the church sanctuary to stand behind the old priest. It was a woman, dressed in a simple, dark dress, her face framed by a widow's shawl. It was Mara Ellison. A collective gasp went through the crowd. These people had heard the rumors. They knew the wanted posters. They had been told she was a fugitive, a murderer. Yet here she was, seeking sanctuary at the altar of God. From his vantage point at the side window of the depot office, Beck saw it all. He saw Madero's gambit, saw Mara's brave appearance. It was his cue. He hefted the heavy ledger and moved to the sacristy window at the back of the mission, a small, high opening used for ventilation. He pushed it open. Inside, Mara heard the soft creak. She turned. Beck's face appeared in the opening. Now, Mara, he hissed. He pushed the heavy book through the window. She caught it, staggering under its weight. She turned and walked to a wooden lectern near the priest. Placing the heavy book upon it, she broke the old wax seal. Her hands trembled as she opened the book, the ancient pages whispering as they turned. Padre, she said, her voice shaking but clear. The truth is here. She ran her finger down a page, finding the entry. Then she began to read, her voice growing stronger, more confident with every word, carrying across the silent, transfixed plaza. Page 112, an entry dated April the 17th, 1876, the transfer of title for the property known as Coyote Spring. She paused, her eyes finding Silas Drummond on the platform. Here is the signature of my late husband, Jacob Ellison, accepting his inheritance. And here is the official seal of the territorial notary. Her voice rose, ringing with the power of undeniable fact. A date and a signature, and a seal, all recorded 1 full year before Mr. Drummond's so-called new regulations were ever filed. An uproar swept through the crowd. It was no longer a polite, passive audience. It was a gathering of people who understood the sanctity of a signature, the power of a legal deed. They understood they were witnessing a monumental fraud being exposed. On the platform, Lieutenant Pike's face was a mask of shock and fury. He had been made a party to a lie. He started down the steps, his hand on his sidearm. "That book is evidence. I'm confiscating it," he yelled, pushing through the crowd toward the church. He was stopped by the small, frail form of Padre Madero, who stood in his path, his arms outstretched. The priest's voice was no longer gentle. It boomed with the authority of centuries. "You will halt, Lieutenant. This book is now a record of this church. He who touches the archives of the Holy Mother Church risks excommunication." Pike, a God-fearing man despite his profession, froze in his tracks, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. Silas Drummond's face was a twisted mask of fury. The facade of the benevolent businessman had been shattered. All that was left was the raw, snarling greed of a predator. He turned to the man standing just behind the platform, a man who had been watching the proceedings with a cold, detached amusement. "Tolland Graves." "Get her," Drummond snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Mara. "Get the woman, I want her." Graves nodded, a slow, wolfish smile spreading across his face. This was what he was paid for. He and his two hard-faced men started forward, shoving their way through the crowd, their hands on their guns. Beck saw the tide turn. The time for words was over. He ran from the sacristy, back into the main mailroom of the depot. In the corner, waiting for shipment to a mining camp, was a large, heavy barrel of kerosene. He gritted his teeth against the pain in his side and put his shoulder to it. It was heavy, but it moved. He rolled it to the open back door, which stood at the top of a short, sloping ramp that led down to the alley. With a final, desperate heave, he pushed the barrel out the door. It tipped, teetered, and then began to roll. Slowly at first, then gathering speed as it bumped down the ramp. It hit the alley, bounced off the far wall, and rolled out into the crowded plaza. A runaway missile of chaos. It slammed into the corner of the blacksmith's stall, the impact splitting the wooden staves. Kerosene, dark and oily, sloshed across the ground. A stray spark from the blacksmith's forge, still glowing with residual heat, was all it took. The world erupted in a flash of orange flame and thick, black, choking smoke. It was not a violent explosion, but a sudden, terrifying conflagration. The crowd screamed, a single, unified cry of panic. The orderly gathering dissolved into a stampede as people fought to get away from the fire and smoke. In that instant of chaos, Mara looked up the bell tower. Padre Madero, anticipating this, had already let the end of the thick bell rope fall. It dangled just a few feet from the church steps. As Graves and his men fought their way through the panicked mob, Mara grabbed the rope, kicked off from the steps, and swung out over the crowd. She landed in a heap at the bottom, just as Beck, his face grimed with soot, emerged from the smoke-filled alley. He caught her, pulling her to her feet. "This way." They plunged into the river of fleeing people, letting the current of panic carry them along, shielding them from view. Graves, momentarily blinded by the smoke, roared in frustration. "Don't lose them!" Drummond screamed from the platform. As they were swept along, a side door to a saloon was thrown open. A stout woman with a flour-dusted apron, the saloon owner jerked her head. "In here the back way!" she yelled. She was one of the dozens of small ranchers and business owners who had been slowly choked by the syndicate's control of the water. Today, she chose her side. They darted through the dark, beer-smelling saloon and out the back door. Emerging into another alley, they ran, hand in hand, the sounds of the chaotic plaza fading behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the Cornet Bridge, the wooden span that crossed the dry arroyo on the edge of town. They paused on the bridge, gasping for breath, and looked back. Red Mesa was a scene of chaos. The fire was already being brought under control by a hastily formed bucket brigade, but the plaza was in turmoil. On the platform, the beautiful syndicate banner had been torn from its moorings in the panic. It lay on the ground, a crumpled heap of cloth being trampled into the dust by a dozen running feet. They had won the battle. But as Beck looked back at the town, he saw Lieutenant Pike, his face like thunder, barking orders to a group of soldiers. He saw Talon Graves, his cold eyes scanning the edges of the crowd, a hunter seeking a lost trail. And he saw Silas Drummond, his face a mask of pure, murderous hatred, screaming orders that were lost in the noise. Pike would not give up. His authority had been challenged, and he would come after them with the full force of the law. Drummond would not give up. His empire had been threatened, and he would come after them with the full force of his limitless greed. Then, the wind shifted. It was the same wind that had brought them the smell of smoke the night they had fled, but this time, it was coming from the west, from the direction of Juniper Draw, and it carried a familiar, heartbreaking scent, the smell of dry grass, of old pine, and of burning hay. Mara smelled it too. She looked at Beck, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. His barn, his cabin, his home. Their small victory had turned to ash before they could even taste it. Retaliation had been swift and absolute, while they had been fighting for the truth in Red Mesa. Drummond's men had been erasing their past, ensuring that even if they survived, they would have nothing left to return to. The war had just begun. The smell of their own lives burning reached them first. A bitter, acrid perfume of scorched pine and roasting hay carried on the wind. It was a scent of total violation. They rode not just from the law, but toward the fire, desperation a spur in their flanks. They broke through the line of cottonwoods at the edge of Juniper Draw to a scene from hell. The cabin still stood, untouched, but the barn Beck's sanctuary. The heart of his small, solitary world was a roaring inferno. The fire was new, greedy. Flames licked at the night sky, devouring the dry, aged wood of the roof, which was just beginning to sag inward. There was no thought, only action. The stampede in Red Mesa had scattered their pursuers, but they would be close behind. They had only moments. "The horses!" Beck yelled, his voice a raw bark of command. He slid from his mare, his wounded side screaming in protest, and ran toward the roaring mouth of the barn. Mara was right behind him, but she ran for the small, adjacent lean-to where he kept his tools and supplies. Beck plunged into the blinding, choking smoke. The heat was a physical blow. He heard the high, terrified screaming of his animals. His mare, the one he'd named Dusty, and the sturdy pack mule were tied in their stalls, rearing against their ropes, their eyes wide with white-ringed terror. The air was too thick to breathe. He pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, drew his knife, and slashed through the lead ropes. "Go get!" he roared, slapping Dusty's flank. The mare bolted, a gray ghost disappearing through the smoke. The mule, more stubborn, needed a hard shove before it followed, braying in panic. He turned to go and saw Mara, her face streaked with soot, struggling to drag a heavy, iron-bound wooden chest from the lean-to. His tools, his anvil, the few possessions his father had left him, the things a man would need to rebuild a life from ashes. He grabbed the other handle, his muscles straining, the fire in his side a matching inferno to the one consuming his barn. "Together," he grunted. They heaved. The chest scraped over the hard-packed earth. Behind them, a deafening crack and a roar, the main roof beam gave way. Collapsing in a volcano of sparks and cinders, they fell to the ground, shielding their heads, the heat scorching their backs. They had made it. With seconds to spare, they stood panting, illuminated by the terrible firelight, watching 15 years of his life turn to smoke. But they were not alone. "Well," a cold, familiar voice drawled, "looks like you made it home, just in time for the party." Talon Graves emerged from the shadows, flanked by his two gunmen, but he was not the main force. Beyond him, fanned out in a wide, precise semicircle, was a line of dark blue, Lieutenant Pike and a dozen cavalrymen, their carbines held ready, and at the center, sitting on a fine bay horse near the entrance to Dead Colt Gate, the main trail to the border, was Silas Drummond himself. He had set up a command post, a supply wagon sitting behind him, his syndicate banner planted in the dirt like a conqueror's flag. They were surrounded. The burning barn was at their back. Pike's men formed the left flank. Graves' men held the right, on the high ground near the pass. Drummond, the Spider, sat in the middle, blocking their only escape route. This was not a pursuit. It was an execution. Beck looked at Mara. Her face was grim, her hand resting on the small Smith Wesson in her sash. He had his Colt. They had perhaps 20 rounds between them. Against 20 men. The odds were impossible. He looked around, his gaze frantic, searching for anything. A rock, a ditch, a shadow. And then he saw it. His eyes followed the line of the dry arroyo that snaked through his property. The arroyo that was fed, in the wet season, by Coyote Spring, his spring. He grabbed Mara's arm. "The sluice," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. She looked at him, confused. "My father, he built an irrigation gate to water the south pasture. It holds back the last of the spring water, a small reserve." It was 100 yards away. A heavy iron wheel set in a stone cistern, hidden by a tangle of overgrown mesquite. It was their only chance. "Cover me," he said. "Beck, you can't. Cover me!" He broke into a staggering run, his wounded side sending lances of agony up to his ribs. A shot rang out, then another. Graves' men, firing from the high ground. The bullets kicked up dust at his feet. Mara didn't hesitate. She raised her small pistol and fired twice at the muzzle flashes on the ridge. It was a laughable defense, a pea shooter against a cannon, but it was enough. The shooters flinched, surprised by the return fire. Beck reached the cistern. He threw himself at the rusted iron wheel, his hand slipping on the cold metal. It wouldn't budge. He put his boots against the stone and pulled, his body screaming. He heard Mara fire again. He heard Pike yelling, "Hold your fire, I want them alive." Mara ran to him, holstering her pistol, and added her weight to the wheel. "Together," she panted. They pulled, their muscles burning, with a deep protesting groan of metal that had been silent for a decade. The gear caught, the gate opened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a dark, gurgling sound, a small, black tongue of water, thick with silt, spilled over the stone lip and into the dry, thirsty arroyo. It was not a flood. It was a trickle, but it was followed by more. The last of Coyote Spring's lifeblood, a dark, determined flow, began to snake its way down the draw. It moved faster than they could have hoped, the parched, baked earth unable to absorb it, channeling it down the path of least resistance, directly toward Lieutenant Pike's cavalry line. "What is that?" Pike yelled, his horse high-stepping nervously. His men looked down, confused. The water reached their horses' hooves. The dry, powdery dust of the arroyo turned, in an instant, to thick, greasy, boot-sucking mud. A horse screamed as it lost its footing. A trooper was thrown. Another's mount began to panic, sinking to its hocks. "Dismount!" Pike roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Form a line, dismount!" His perfect, disciplined semicircle dissolved into a chaotic, scrambling line of men, pulling their terrified horses from the sudden quagmire. Their tactical advantage was gone, swallowed by the mud. At that same moment, a new sound was heard. The rumble of wagons, the shouting of men. Over the eastern ridge, a small cavalcade of people appeared. Settlers, the blacksmith, the saloon owner from Red Mesa, dozens of small-time ranchers and homesteaders, drawn by the pillar of smoke from Beck's barn. They arrived, carrying buckets, shovels, and their own rifles, expecting to find a disaster. Instead, they found a battlefield. They saw the burning barn, the syndicate banner, the mired U.S. cavalry, and the two figures of Beck and Mara, standing side by side, covered in soot, beside their burning home. The standoff was no longer a private affair. It now had an audience. Mara saw the opportunity. Pike's line was broken. Graves' men were distracted by the arrival of the settlers. All that remained was Drummond, arrogant and exposed, by his wagon. She looked around, her eyes landing on the ruins of a fence, destroyed when the mule had bolted. A spool of barbed wire lay tangled in the dirt. She ran to Dusty, the mare, who was trembling nearby. She grabbed the reins, her voice a low, soothing murmur. "Easy, girl, one more run." She uncoiled a long strand of the vicious wire, tying one end securely to her saddle horn. She looked at Beck. "Make them look at you." Beck understood. He stepped forward, into the firelight, his hands empty and held away from his sides. "Drummond!" he yelled, his voice carrying across the draw. "This is my land you've lost." It was the distraction she needed. As all eyes turned to Beck, Mara kicked Dusty into a gallop. She rode low, a shadow against the fire, not at the enemy, but past them. She galloped the length of the clearing, dragging the barbed wire, and looped it around a sturdy outcropping of rock on the far side, pulling it taut, ankle high. Across the main path of retreat, a tripwire, a snare, hidden in the shadows, blocking the wagon and the path to Dead Colt Gate. She rode back, disappearing into the darkness, her trap set on the ridge. Tolland Graves watched the entire scene unfold. He saw the settlers, his potential targets, and was surprised. They were not a lynch mob. They were a community. They had come with buckets, and as he watched, they began to do the unthinkable. They formed a bucket brigade, using the muddy, new flowing water from the arroyo, and began to fight the fire, trying to save Beck's cabin. Graves had been hired to retrieve a fugitive. He was a man of contracts, a man who prided himself on a certain professional code. But this was something else. This was arson. This was a land war. He watched one of Drummond's syndicate men, a hired gun, walk toward the cabin with a lit torch, clearly intending to finish the job. He saw the settlers, his own people, homesteaders, fighting to save it. He had made a mistake. He was on the wrong side, down in the draw. Pike, his face a mask of humiliation and mud, was advancing on foot. "Ellison Cole, you are under arrest for inciting a riot." His horse, struggling in the mud behind him, slipped and went down on its side with a pathetic whinny. Pike was now a man on foot, covered in filth, his authority as mired as his mount. Mara stepped out from the shadows. Her voice was not a plea. It was a judgment. It was as clear and cold as the water they had unleashed. "Lieutenant Pike," she shouted, and all the settlers turned to listen. "You swore an oath to protect the property and the people of this territory, not to be a hired dog for a thief. Look at this. Look at our home. Don't you dare stain your badge with these ashes." Pike froze. He was a proud man, a man of the uniform, and he was being shamed, publicly, in front of the very citizens he was sworn to protect. He looked at Drummond, then at the settlers, his face a complex map of rage, doubt, and profound shame. Silas Drummond saw it all slipping away. Pike was wavering. Graves was sitting on his ridge, doing nothing. The settlers were defiant. His plan was dissolving into mud and smoke. His mask of civilized progress vanished, revealing the raw, panicked tyrant beneath. "You'll all hang," he shrieked, his voice thin and high. He pulled his own pearl-handled revolver and fired. Not at Beck, not at Mara. He fired into the crowd of settlers. The shot was high, a warning shot, but it was the final, unforgivable act. He had fired on unarmed civilians. On the ridge, the syndicate gunman with the torch lunged toward the cabin. He never made it. Tolland Graves was on him in 2 strides. He didn't draw his gun. He hit the man with his fist, a single, brutal, downward chop that sent the man sprawling into the mud, his torch extinguishing with a hiss. "Guns down!" Graves roared, his voice a thunderclap that cut through the chaos. His 2 men, startled, looked at him. "I said, lower your weapons. This is settlers' land, not Drummond's drawing room. The contract is void. We're done." He had made his choice. He was a bounty hunter, not a monster. The entire battlefield was in chaos. Pike's men were looking at Pike. Graves' men were looking at Graves. Drummond's few remaining syndicate men were looking at their boss, who had just started a war with the entire territory. Beck saw his final move. The water was still flowing. He and Mara ran to the head of the arroyo, to a small retaining wall of stones he'd built years ago. They kicked at it, dislodging the rocks, diverting the flow of the water once again. The muddy torrent turned, seeking a new path. It poured directly into a low-lying patch of ground to their left, a place known as Catclaw Alley, a place Beck knew was a natural sinkhole, a soft, deep bed of silt. Drummond's men, trying to outflank the settlers and get to Beck, spurred their horses directly into it. The horses stopped as if they'd hit a wall, sinking instantly to their bellies in the churning, watery mud. They were stuck, trapped. Their guns were useless. It was over. Pike, seeing Drummond's men captured and Graves' forces standing down, finally raised his hand, his voice thick with defeat. "Stand down! Men, stand down!" Silas Drummond looked around, his eyes wide with a rat's panic. His army was gone. His allies had turned. His enemies were watching him, and the settlers were closing in. He was alone. He wrenched his horse's head around, spurred it brutally, and fled. He galloped away from the border, away from his wagon now blocked by Mara's hidden wire, and back toward the east. He fled, a lone, desperate figure, back toward the one place he thought was still his. Beck and Mara watched him go. "He's running for Coyote Narrows," Beck said, his voice grim. Mara checked the loads in her pistol. "Then that's where we end this." The final pursuit had begun. The pursuit was a grim, silent race against the dawn. They rode not with the wild abandon of a chase, but with the grim, plodding certainty of fate. Drummond was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He fled east, not toward the border, but back into the heart of the territory he had sought to conquer, his mind clearly broken by the collapse of his authority. Beck and Mara followed, their borrowed horses tireless, their own exhaustion a distant, gnawing ache they refused to acknowledge. The rising sun cast their long shadows before them, stretching and pointing the way. He was leading them back to the beginning, back to Coyote Narrows. He was waiting for them at the western mouth of the canyon, the same place where he had set his ambush. But now, he was the one who was trapped. He sat his lathered horse at the very edge of the gorge, a lone, pathetic figure silhouetted against the morning sky. The wind, a constant, mournful presence in this place, howled through the narrow rock passages, a sound like 1,000 accusing voices. It whipped at Drummond's fine black coat and tore at the reins in his hands. He looked like a king presiding over a kingdom of dust and rock. He had his revolver in his hand. As they approached, reining in their horses 100 feet away, he raised it. "This is my land," he screamed, his voice thin and reedy against the power of the wind. "Mine. I brought the law here. I brought progress. Water doesn't belong to the dead, or to savages. It belongs to the strong, the ones who have the will to take it." He was no longer speaking to them. He was screaming his creed at the uncaring sky, at the ancient rocks that had witnessed 1,000 such acts of greed. Beck didn't answer with words. He kicked his horse into a run. It was a fool's charge, a desperate, final gamble to close the distance. He was a single man, wounded and exhausted, charging a man with a loaded gun. Drummond's face twisted into a mask of triumphant hatred. He leveled his pistol and fired. The world seemed to slow down. Beck felt a searing, violent blow to his right shoulder, a force that spun him in the saddle. It felt like being kicked by a mule. Mara screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror that was ripped away by the wind. The black shawl she still wore was torn from her shoulders by the force of their gallop, and it flew behind her like a dark, tattered battle flag. Beck clung to the saddle, his vision graying at the edges, fighting to stay conscious. He was not going to fall. Not now. Not when they were so close. But Mara did not scream and ride on. She reacted. In her hands was not her pistol, but a coil of rope she had taken from the back of Beck's saddle. A simple lariat, but in the end of it, she had knotted a heavy lead weight, a sinker used for fishing in the deep pools of the Rio Grande. She had been preparing for this. As Dusty the mare galloped past Drummond's position, Mara rose in her stirrups. She was no longer a victim or a widow. She was a warrior of the Yavapai, her ancestors who had hunted in this very canyon. She swung the weighted rope once, twice, a singing, whirring circle of death in the air. On the third swing, she released it. The rope flew, a perfect, unerring spiral. It did not aim for his head or his body. It wrapped itself, once, twice, around Drummond's outstretched wrist, the one holding the gun. The lead weight, carried by its own momentum, cinched the loop tight with a brutal, sickening crack. Drummond screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the bones in his wrist snapped. The pearl-handled revolver flew from his nerveless fingers, skittering across the rocky ledge and disappearing over the edge of the canyon. Before Drummond could react, before he could even comprehend what had happened, Beck was on him. He launched himself from his saddle, his wounded body a projectile of pure, focused rage. He hit Drummond like a thunderclap, and the two men went down in a tangled, desperate heap of limbs and dust. Beck's vision was a red haze of pain, but his hands found their mark. He pinned Drummond to the ground, one hand on his throat, the other twisting his good arm behind his back. Drummond thrashed, a panicked, squirming thing, his arrogance and his cruelty dissolving into a puddle of pure, animal terror. Mara was there a moment later. She dismounted and walked to the two struggling men, her face a calm, cold mask of judgment. In her hand, she held the leather tube. She slid the ancient Spanish deed from its protective casing. She did not look at the crowd of settlers, who were now arriving in a dusty, silent wave, led by Tolland Graves. She did not look at Lieutenant Pike, who stood apart, his face grim, a silent witness. She looked only at the terrified, blubbering face of the man pinned beneath Beck. Her voice was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as chipped flint, and it cut through the howling of the wind. Article 3 of the Coyote Spring Grant, she read, her voice ringing with an authority that was older than the territory itself. Any party, private or corporate, found to have willingly and maliciously damaged, diverted, or otherwise destroyed the natural source of the water for the purposes of private gain, shall hereby forfeit all and any claim to its use. She rolled the parchment up. You are a trespasser, Mr. Drummond, and a vandal. The settlers, their faces hard and weathered, formed a silent, menacing circle. Graves stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun, not as a threat, but as a symbol of the new order. Pike stood frozen, his soldier's duty at war with his man's conscience. For a moment, it seemed as if the very land was holding its breath. The pressure broke Silas Drummond. Pinned to the earth, his weapon gone, his grand plans in ashes, his body broken, his crimes read aloud for all to hear. He simply shattered. It wasn't my idea, he babbled, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate light. Finch, the foreman, he said we could scare her off. He was the one who said we should hang her. I just paid for the rope and the ledger. The notary was a drunk. It was so easy to make a new page, and the fire was Graves's idea. No, wait, it was Pike. Pike said we had to make an example. He was lying, confessing, and accusing all in the same panicked, pathetic breath. But in his terror, he had given them the one thing they still needed. A confession, shouted into the wind for a dozen witnesses to hear. A low, dangerous growl rumbled through the crowd of settlers. They had heard enough. They began to surge forward, their faces a mixture of fury and a hunger for a justice that had been denied them for too long. Beck looked up at Mara. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes shining with a fierce, terrible light. He saw the end of her pain, the beginning of her peace. He looked at her, and with a single, small nod, he gave her his consent. It's over, he said. He stood up, pulling the whimpering, broken form of Silas Drummond with him, and shoved him toward the crowd. They took him, the blacksmith, the saloon owner, the farmers, their hands, hard and calloused from a lifetime of honest work, fell upon him. Their justice would be swift and sure. Beck turned his back on them and walked toward Mara. The world seemed to fade away. There was only her. They returned to the ruins of their home as the sun climbed high in the sky. The barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. The cabin, saved by the settlers, was scorched and smoke-stained, but it stood in the small patch of swept-clean earth behind the cabin, the place where they had first shared their truths, the place where they had fallen together in the moonlight. She tended to his new wound. The bullet had torn a clean, hot furrow through the flesh of his shoulder. It was painful, but it would heal. She had her dark wool overskirt in her hands, the one she had used as his pillow. It was a remnant of her old life, a symbol of her widowhood. Now, it would become a symbol of their future. Once again, she tore a clean strip of cloth from it, as she wrapped the bandage around his shoulder. Her touch was not just that of a nurse, but of a partner, of a wife. It was a silent, powerful affirmation. We are still here. We have a future. When she was done, he reached out and pulled her to him. They didn't kiss, they simply held each other, their bodies pressed close, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there for a long time, their breathing deep and slow, a shared rhythm of survival and relief. It was an embrace of profound, quiet love, forged in fire and tempered by loss. It was warm, respectful, and absolute. Later, Toland Graves rode up, leading a horse with Silas Drummond tied securely in the saddle. "The settlers have formed a town watch," Graves said, his voice formal, respectful. "They'll be taking him to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. They asked me to tell you that the deed to Coyote Spring is now the first entry in a new town ledger." He had found his honor again. Lieutenant Pike sat his horse a short distance away. He did not speak. He just looked at Beck, and in the clear morning light, he gave a single, sharp nod. It was an apology. It was a salute. And then he turned his men and rode away, a soldier who had finally chosen the right side. Beck took Mara's hand, her fingers laced with his, a perfect, natural fit, together. They walked across the small patch of ground, their ground, and stopped in the very spot where they had huddled against the cold the night before. They had fallen there in desperation. Now, they stood there in strength, their faces turned toward the future, the sound of a community, their community, rebuilding itself behind them. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help share it with more listeners like you.